So the Arc's come up. What's next? What I want to do in this talk is to give you briefly some of the background to the Arc and show how, in fact, the initial emphasis on the Arc was as a house building program. It was to deliver houses to meet the government's targets. And then it sort of pivoted away from that to one which emphasizes the economic performance of the Arc. But it's really important to understand that initial push was for housing, not for jobs or the economy. And so we're going to look at the Oxfam Arc proposals in 2018 in this Partnering for Prosperity document from the National Infrastructure, and then see how the housing, jobs and the economy were originally defined in that document, and then look at the current status of the 5 pillars of the Arc as defined in that document. Now you'll be aware that towards the middle and end of last year, there were rumours that the Arc was being shelved, or rather put on the back burner. And as a result of that, there have been certain developments since the arrival, effectively, of Michael Gove in the Department for Levelling Up. And the developers have produced a rearguard action to this shelving of the Arc. They want it to go ahead in a rather different form. And so we'll then look at a rather uncertain future for the Arc. And in the next few minutes, I want to really show how we've gone from the left of your screen, from Partnering for Prosperity, to Bidwell's radical capital report for growth at all costs in the space of just 4 years. First of all, these are the 5 pillars that were defined by the Partnering for Prosperity document: a Oxcam Expressway, East-West Railway, 1 million houses, 1.1 million new jobs, and 163 billion increase in the economic output. Now, as you know, the expressway has been cancelled, although roads are being suggested to replace the expressway. And we want, first of all, to look at how the housing numbers were defined. Now, this document by Savills was an input into Partnering for Prosperity, and Savills looked at 3 possible housing growth scenarios. They based it on the current 3-year average delivery. In these histograms, the different colours refer to the different local authorities. So don't worry about the colours, just look at the total numbers on the y-axis for the different categories of housing developments. So this is what the Arc was delivering in about 2014. And the first scenario was a business as usual. So it slightly upped the ante on the current 3-year average delivery. And then Savills really pulled out all the stops on what it called its incremental scenario. Now, what you have to understand is the incremental scenario is in fact based on the highest possible growth and the highest possible immigration figures that the Office of National Statistics were prepared to entertain. Savills then went a step beyond that for their transformational scenario, and in the transformational scenario, they added 7,000 houses, that's the grey bit on top of that histogram, 23% of all new houses, which were earmarked already for London commuters. And so those 7,000 added to 23,000 for everything else to produce a total of 30,000 houses per year in the transformational scenario. This is going way above even the maximum growth rate of all existing housing formulae. And if you apply those growth figures each year to the 34 years of the Partnering for Prosperity report, you get the total number of houses predicted at the bottom. And the one in red is, of course, the million house target of the transformational scenario that the National Infrastructure Commission preferred. Now, I really want to stress that that scenario really wasn't about jobs or the economy. In fact, if you look in the document to see how Savills justified it, it was only about houses. Here are 2 statements here. There are 2 sources of additional growth beyond the levels of the highest growth, highest immigration strategic housing market assessment, which is the housing market formula to generate the number of houses required. First of all, the Arc should take a share of the national needs, which is 300,000 houses a year. And secondly, it should cover the needs of other areas, most notably London, which has never produced enough houses for the growth of the London population. It really was all about housing to begin with. And in welcoming the Partnering for Prosperity report, the very first sentence of the government response to that is shown here. The government supports the NIC's ambition to build up to 1 million new houses by 2050, blah, blah. So it's a housing prospect. Now, those million houses would go now across the 5 counties of the Arc as defined map here. If you add 1 million houses to the current housing stock, that's a 66% increase in all the houses, and 1.9 extra people, that's a 51% increase in the existing population. These increases are far in excess of the average ONS predicted increase in the UK population of about 16% to 2050. Then Cambridge Econometrics came along. They worked with Savills housing figures, and they effectively asked the question, well, if we've got that number of houses, then how many jobs can we support in those houses, and what will be the increase in the economic output? And they started with a baseline of 2014 and they went up to 2050. And you can see the increase in jobs and the increase in GVA from the 2014 base. And the additional jobs, so the 1.1 million here, and the additional income is 163 billion. Now, what we've discovered by looking at this Cambridge Econometrics report is that 33% of the increase in the economic output is simply due to increasing the number of workers. If you've got more workers, you've got more economic output. 57% is due to an increase in the output per worker, and only 9% is due to the claimed agglomeration effect, which is effectively saying the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, something which Cambridge Econometrics banged on a lot about in this major document. So effectively, you could put more workers anywhere in the country, make the same assumptions about their output per worker, and you get 90% of the benefits claimed for the ARC anywhere else in the UK you chose to put that development. And what we've got here is the percentage annual increase in jobs between those two dates and the percentage increase in economic output. It's just under 3% per year increase in output between those two dates. And we'll come back to these figures later on. Now, of course, if you think of houses, jobs, and GVA, economic output, they're of course linked together. You can increase them all and you'll get a greater GVA, or you can decrease them all. But what you can't do, which is what many politicians assume you can, is you can reduce the number of houses, but you can still increase the GVA and the jobs. You simply can't. If you provide those extra jobs, you've got to have the extra houses for them. Now, because our campaign and many others made a song and dance about the million house figures, what happened then was the government actually stopped talking about the houses. In fact, Bev Hindle, the director of the Oxcom ARC Leadership Group, said he had told the government to stop talking about houses, so the government did stop talking. The Minister of State for Housing, Christopher Pincher, in a Westminster Hall debate last year said, there is no government target for the ARC, there never has been a government target for the ARC, which is stretching even being economical with the truth. In the same breath, in the same speech, he said, but we'll still have the same number of GVA and jobs as the National Infrastructure Commission wanted. You cannot have the two things without the other, the increase in the number of houses, which all politicians recognise as being poisonous for the Oxcom ARC scheme. It's simply too many. So where are we now? Well, we've got the 5 pillars. The expressway has been cancelled. William will explain how East West Rail is only part funded. We really don't know how many houses they're proposing to inflict on the ARC. Is it 1 million? Is it none, as Mr. Pincher said? Or is it simply some, a number between the two? If you can't define the houses, of course, you can't define either the number of jobs or economic output. So the ARC is really in a state of chaos at the moment, or at least a state of confusion. Nobody knows anything about these 4 pillars. Will they be funded? Won't they be funded? So the next question really, well, who's in charge here? Who's driving it? It was one of Boris Johnson's Project Speed, and we've got the various ministries on the top here: Department for Transport, Housing, Department for Business, DEFRA, and of course the Department for International Trade, all responding to edicts from 10 Downing Street and of course the Treasury next door that was expected to fund the government's participation in this project. And then there was a very important ARC leadership group set up within the Ministry of Housing, which were the local partners of local authorities, local enterprise partnerships, LEPs, and the 9 ARC universities. And between them, they produced a whole series of documents on the economic prospectus, the ARC universities group, the local industrial strategies, and so on. At the same time, the DFT produced something on transport, DEFRA produced something on the environment, and the Department for International Trade was advertising its wares globally, ARC's wares globally. Now, the government proposed that it would set up an ARC growth body in the middle of last year, which would bang all heads together in Whitehall and get the ARC developing along the lines of the National Infrastructure Commission. As far as we're aware, the ARC growth body hasn't yet been constituted, but it provided one of the 5 Freedom of Information requests, which some of you very kindly supported us on. The first FOI request was to ask about the current status of the Oxcam-ARC team within the Department for Housing, and 9 of you asked for that request on our behalf. The second request was, what is the state of the 4 proposed new towns west of Cambridge? Emma Carriaga was asked to look at the prospect of 4 new towns west of Cambridge and to produce a report by November of last year. As far as we're aware, this hasn't yet been produced. The third FOI request was whether or not this ARC growth body has yet been constituted. We really don't know, and if it has, who's on it? 31 of you chose that request to send in to the department. We'll see if we get a response. And 46 wanted the answer to question 4. Where are the results of the ARC Spatial Framework consultation that ran from July to October of last year? We're still waiting to hear what the rest of the people across the ARC think about the government plans. We understand that a lot of people were very, very reluctant to see the southeast of the country overdeveloped, which is the same response as we got to our own Stark survey that you may have taken part in. And the 5th request was to ask for the terms of reference of the director of the Oxcam-ARC Leadership Group, currently Bev Hindle. Was he appointed independently? What are his terms of reference? So where are we now? Well, in the middle of last year, of course, Michael Gove replaced Robert Jenrick in the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, changed the name of the department to the Department of Levelling Up, and proceeded perhaps to put his money where his department's name was, to do levelling up across the country, and certainly to downgrade the ARC plans in government circles. So towards the end of last year, we began to see headlines like this. Is Boris going to abandon the Oxcam-ARC? Or, for example, will the top-down projects be pigeonholed by Michael Gove? And then early this year, in January, February, really as a result of a gesture across the room, it was nothing more than that. Michael Gove was asked the question across the room, what's happened to the Oxcam-ARC? And apparently he made a toilet flushing gesture, which everybody has since interpreted as the ARC being flushed away, flushed down the drain. And all of these headlines arose as a result of that gesture being reported by South Cambridgeshire. And then really in response to the likelihood of the ARC being shelved, the property developers, the universities, the investors and others who stood to gain from ARC investment produced this radical capital report saying we should do this anyway, we should go ahead anyway, even if the government isn't interested.
Sit down now.
And that radical capital report included its own predictions for the future growth of the arts economy. So these are the NIC's growth figures. These are Bidwell's growth figures. Now notice that they looked at a period of only 8 years, the next 8 years from this year to 2030. They reckon the GVA can increase from 115 billion to 235 billion in the space of 8 years. So it's actually doubling in the space of 8 years. That's a compound rate of interest of 9% a year compared to the 3% a year, obviously over a much longer period, but these are annual figures, the 3% a year of the National Infrastructure Commission. How on earth does Bidwell's imagine a 3-fold increase in the rate of growth of the arts economy when it's still kept exactly the same jobs trajectory as the NIC had imagined? Where do these Bidwell's figures come from? Well, if you look at the report, it's Bidwell's own research. And we've challenged Bidwell's to show us the numbers, show us the back of the envelope on which these calculations were made. And we've drawn a blank here. We've asked the senior scientists who have supported this report, they've written to the Chancellor saying this ARC should go ahead. We've asked them to get Bidwell's to release their calculations, and basically we've heard absolutely nothing. Well, you've all heard of fantasy football. It seems to me that Bidwell's has just invented the economic equivalent. This is fantasy economics. And it's being supported by a lot of respectful people who haven't really asked the details of these predictions. So what's next? What's coming next? Well, we all hoped or thought the circus was leaving town with the news that Gove had shelved the ARC, but in fact, Just when you thought it was all over, yet another Oxcam Arc meeting is planned. There's one next week, the 27th of April, are the next steps for the Oxcam Arc. Well, it's been shelved, hasn't it? The developers don't think so. The developers want to push ahead. There's one in October this year called Oxcam Arc Development Conference. This is an annual thing from Built Environment Networking. It's going ahead as if nothing has happened. So what we had is, before the ARC was shelved, Chris Krasnowski, who was the portfolio director of the Oxcam Arc, said in February of last year, the chair of the ARC growth body, the thing that hasn't yet been constituted, will need the gravitas to fly over to Beijing and have the conversations we may need for that global engagement. And then after the shelving of the ARC, Bev Hindle, the director of the Oxcam Arc Leaders Group, said the ARC Leaders Group will continue to work with the Department for International Trade to develop a joint internationalization plan for the ARC. What this means is that if the government's not going to fund it, the developers want international money to fund it instead. The problem here is, of course, that international funders are not really interested in hospitals, schools, water and electricity supplies, clinics, roads and railways. They're simply interested in making a profit from the brain power of the major universities in the ARC. We are going to have, if we're not very careful, expansion before infrastructure, and that is a recipe for absolute disaster. The government's not in control. The last thing we want is for developers to be in control. So we have to be very careful, we have to be very watchful. It's a time of great uncertainty, but certainly the property developers are determined to push this forward as fast as possible. So what we've got to do in future, Stop the ARC will be watching this space. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Right.